before we dive into today's mystery, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps us keep uncovering the unknown. Now, let's begin. Father's Day dawned quietly over Denver, the sun casting golden light across the city's towering skyline. The streets downtown were eerily empty, a ghost town in the heart of a bustling metropolis. For most people, it was a day of celebration, of backyard barbecues and heartfelt cards. But for one man, it was the perfect day to execute the most brutal bank heist in the city's history. At United Bank Tower, a 56-story behemoth known for its iconic cash register design, the halls were quiet. The bank was closed, yet deep within its underground levels, a small team of security guards remained on duty, oblivious to the fate that awaited them. They had no idea that as they made their morning rounds, a shadow was slipping into the building, disguised, prepared, and armed. At exactly 9 a.m., a man approached the bank's side entrance. He walked with confidence, dressed in a sharp dark suit, a narrow-brimmed fedora, dark sunglasses, and a neatly trimmed mustache. A Band-Aid covered a small portion of his cheek, a detail that would later baffle investigators. His polished appearance wasn't just for show. It was a carefully crafted illusion, designed to lower suspicion. The man pressed a buzzer near the freight elevator, a back entrance reserved for maintenance staff and executives. When the speaker crackled to life, his voice was steady, authoritative. "This is Robert Bardwell, vice president of the bank. I'm here for an unscheduled inspection," he said. A pause. The guard inside hesitated. Protocol required identification. But at United Bank, those rules had been loosely enforced. The guards had been explicitly told not to question bank officials too aggressively. A moment later, the security door buzzed open. The man stepped inside, his lips curling into the faintest smirk. The trap had worked. Bill McCullum, a 33-year-old security guard, greeted the visitor at the freight elevator. His job was simple: escort high-ranking officials where they needed to go. He barely had time to process the man's presence before a gun was raised to his face. Crack! A single gunshot echoed through the underground corridor, the bullet tearing through McCullum's skull before he could react. His body crumpled instantly, the echo of the gunshot swallowed by the empty halls. The intruder grabbed McCullum's security access card and keys, wiping the grip of his revolver with a gloved hand before moving forward. The first obstacle had been removed. To an outsider, this level of precision and familiarity with the bank's internal layout would seem almost impossible. But to the man now navigating its halls, it was second nature. He had been here before. A former United Bank security officer, he had spent months patrolling these very floors, learning the patterns of the guards, the weaknesses in security, and the one fatal flaw that made this heist possible. After McCullum's murder, the intruder moved quickly. He knew where to go next. His next destination? The security monitor room. The security monitor room was the brain of the bank's surveillance system. From here, guards could see every camera feed, monitor every door, and raise an alarm if needed. If the heist was to succeed, those inside had to be neutralized immediately. Inside, 3 men sat watching a small TV, passing time between routine checks. Phil Manoff, 41, a married father of 2 stepdaughters, was the most senior guard on duty that morning. Scott McCarthy, 21, was fresh-faced, a newlywed, working his first-ever shift at the bank. Todd Wilson, also 21, was McCarthy's best friend. They had applied together to work at United Bank, thinking it would be an easy job. They had no idea that death was about to walk through the door. A sudden metallic beep signaled that someone had entered through the secure man trap, leading to the room. Manoff barely glanced up from the TV. He assumed it was McCullum returning from escorting the visitor. "Get up." The voice was calm, but filled with an unmistakable weight of command. Manoff turned and saw the gun. Before he could react, the intruder forced him at gunpoint into an adjacent room, the battery room. The men were ordered to kneel, hands behind their heads. Then, without hesitation, the shooter fired. 1, 2, 3. For gunshots, the bodies of Manoff, McCarthy, and Wilson slumped to the floor, blood pooling beneath them. The security team was gone. The killer took his time. He searched the monitor room, pulling videotapes from recording machines, ensuring that no footage of him remained. He attempted to break into a supervisor's office, knowing there was one additional camera inside the room that might have captured his face. He fired a shot at the doorknob, tried kicking the glass, but the reinforced structure held firm. Frustrated but undeterred, he moved to his next and final target, the cash vault. At 9:48 a.m., the attacker used McCullum's stolen security card to access the vault's outer man trap. 6 bank tellers were inside, meticulously counting the bank's reserves. They heard footsteps turn and saw a well-dressed man stepping to secured entrance. "Hey, you!" one of them called out, confused. The man turned abruptly, pulling a revolver. The unmistakable click of the hammer cocking sent a chill through the room. "Face down. Hands over your eyes." The tellers obeyed immediately, pressing their bodies against the cold floor. One woman, Nina McGinty, was lucky. She managed to hide under her desk, unseen by the intruder. She stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe. The robber scanned the room. His voice was controlled, methodical. "Who's the cashier?" The tellers hesitated. The term wasn't one they used. Eventually, David Brancato, the manager, raised a trembling hand. "Me," he said. The gunman grabbed Brancato by the collar, forcing him to march from station to station, filling the doctor's satchel with neatly stacked bundles of cash. He was selective, only taking strap bundles, avoiding small bills or marked currency. McGinty, still hiding under her desk, watched in horror as Brancato's eyes briefly flickered toward her hiding spot. He didn't say a word. His silence saved her life. At 9:56 a.m., the bag was full. The gunman shoved Brancato into the man trap with the other tellers, locking them inside. Then he was gone. The heist had taken less than 30 minutes. Yet in that brief window, 4 men had died and $200,000 had vanished. The gunman made his way to the parking deck. He had planned his escape meticulously, using one of the servers' elevators, Elevator 3, to reach the 7th floor of the parking garage. Before leaving, he jammed a Mountain Dew into the man trap's outer door, making it impossible for emergency responders to enter quickly. Once in the parking garage, he disappeared into the morning. By the time the tellers escaped and alerted security, it was too late. The Father's Day massacre was over, but the mystery of who had done it and how he got away was only just beginning. The echo of gunfire had long faded, replaced by an eerie silence inside the United Bank Tower. Outside, the city of Denver moved on, oblivious of the horror that had unfolded beneath its streets. That silence shattered at 10:03 a.m. A frantic fire alarm blared through the bank's underground levels, triggered when the trap tellers finally forced open the man trap door. They burst into the hallway, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. They ran. By the time they reached the main lobby, their voices were hoarse from screaming. "We've been robbed. Call the police." The bank's external security team, stationed on the ground floor, had no idea what had happened. But the moment they saw Brancato and the others, disheveled, panic-stricken, they knew this wasn't an ordinary robbery. A call went out to 911. Minutes later, the first wave of Denver police officers and SWAT teams stormed the bank. They swept through the hallways, weapons raised, moving methodically through the underground labyrinth. Then, they reached the security monitor room. The first officer stopped abruptly, his foot nearly slipping. The floor was slick with blood. The bodies of 3 guards, Manoff, McCarthy, and Wilson, were crumpled on the ground, their lifeless eyes staring into the void. One officer muttered a curse. Then they found McCullum, his corpse in the lower concourse hallway. 4 men, for security guards, executed. The SWAT commander's voice was grim as he radioed in the report. "We're not just dealing with a robbery. We've got a massacre." The news spread like wildfire. By noon, every major news station in Colorado had interrupted regular programming to report on what was being called the Father's Day Massacre. But as the Denver police and the FBI's Violent Crimes Task Force descended upon the scene, one truth became terrifyingly clear. The killer was already gone, and he had left no trace. By mid-afternoon, the United Bank Tower was sealed off like a crime scene from a Hollywood thriller. The FBI arrived in force, dozens of agents, forensic teams, and crime scene specialists swarming the underground levels, meticulously combing for clues. But what they found was disturbing. The security footage? Gone. Every single VCR tape from the surveillance system had been removed, except one. It was still inside the machine, untouched. When agents played it back, they realized why the killer had left it behind. It was blank, a malfunction. The only camera that might have captured the massacre had not been recording at all. It was as if the killer had anticipated everything. Even the bullet strike on the supervisor's office door suggested he had tried to retrieve additional footage. Unsuccessfully. No security footage. No witnesses who had seen his face clearly. The perfect crime. Except for one thing. Forensics did uncover a few critical clues. A Mountain Dew can wedged into the man's trap door, with a fingerprint on it. A palm print in the cash vault. Bloody footprints in the incinerator room near McCullum's body. The Denver police clung to those pieces of evidence like lifelines. They needed a suspect, and fast. And so, they turned their attention to the one person who seemed to know this bank better than anyone. Within 24 hours, a list of potential suspects was compiled. At the top, James W. King, a retired Denver police sergeant. King had worked as a security guard at United Bank Tower for nearly 2 years before resigning in August 1990, less than a year before the heist. But that wasn't the only reason he caught investigators' attention. King had complained bitterly about the bank's security policies, arguing that disarming the guards had made them sitting ducks. He had also been disciplined for refusing to let unauthorized personnel into a restricted area, something that had infuriated him. When 2 FBI agents knocked on his modest Denver bungalow on June 17th, King answered calmly, almost as if he expected them. His demeanor was steady, his responses measured. "Yes, I heard about the robbery," he said. "Tragic." The agents pressed him for his whereabouts on Father's Day. King's answer was odd. He claimed that on the morning of June 16th, he had driven 11 miles to the Capitol Hill Community Center to play chess. The problem? The Denver Chess Club hadn't met there in years. And when King arrived that morning, he had supposedly found the doors locked. "So, you drove all the way there and just turned around?" one agent asked. King nodded. "That's right." The FBI agents exchanged glances. A weak alibi. No witnesses to confirm his story. And then came the most damning detail. His gun. King admitted he had owned a .38 caliber Colt revolver, the same type used in the massacre. But he claimed the gun had a cracked cylinder, so he had thrown it away. That single statement sent red flags through the investigative team. A retired cop discarding his service weapon? Unheard of. King wasn't under arrest yet, but he had just made himself the prime suspect. As weeks passed, pressure mounted for an arrest. Detectives dug into King's personal life, his finances, his behavior before and after the heist. Then, on July 3rd, 1991, a search warrant was executed on King's home. Investigators found a pair of shoes that matched the tread pattern found at the crime scene. A safe deposit box King had upgraded one day after the heist, and stacks of chess books and police procedure manuals, reinforcing the idea that King had planned the crime like a chess game. With circumstantial evidence piling up, the decision was made. King was arrested that night. Reporters swarmed outside Denver's courthouse, cameras flashing as a former police officer was led away in handcuffs. The city erupted, some in shock, others in satisfaction. A cop turned killer? The headlines wrote themselves. But then, the case took a stunning twist. The FBI forensic lab ran tests on King's shoes, and to their astonishment, the shoes found in his house weren't the same ones that made the footprints at the crime scene. The most crucial piece of physical evidence had just fallen apart, and James King's fate would now be decided in the courtroom. James King sat in the defendant's chair, his face expressionless as the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. The eyes of the entire city were on him. Denver's biggest criminal trial in years had begun. It wasn't just any trial. It was televised, one of the first high-profile cases to be broadcast in Colorado's history. The media descended like vultures, cameras rolling as King's defense team and prosecutors squared off in a legal battle that would last 3 weeks. The prosecution, led by Bill Buckley, a seasoned and aggressive district attorney, painted King as a disgruntled ex-cop, a man who had spent years feeling underappreciated, overlooked, and seething with resentment against both the Denver Police Department and United Bank Tower. He wanted revenge, Buckley told the jury in his opening statement, and he wanted to prove to the world that he was smarter than everyone else. Then came the defense, led by Walter Garash, a flamboyant, silver-tongued lawyer with a history of winning impossible cases. He had defended some of Colorado's most notorious criminals and walked them free. Garash turned the tables. This case, he declared, is built entirely on guesswork and assumptions. They have no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no money trail, just a desperate attempt to blame an innocent man. It was clear from the start, this trial would be a war. The jury leaned in, the nation watched, and the battle for James King's fate began. The prosecution's biggest weapon was the eyewitness testimony from the 6 bank tellers who had been inside the vault that morning. Each one took the stand, pointing at James King, claiming he was a man in the disguise. But then, the defense dropped a bombshell. They pulled out the original witness lineup photos taken just 4 days after the heist, where not a single teller had identified King. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. "Let's be very clear," Garash said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Not one of these witnesses saw James King in the immediate aftermath. They only recognized him weeks later, after the police had already arrested him." Then he pulled out a photograph, a famous one. The jury gasped. It was a heavily disguised Harrison Ford, wearing the same hat, sunglasses, and mustache as the bank robber. "This," Garash said, walking toward the jury, "is Harrison Ford, one of the most famous men in the world." He turned to the bank teller, who sat nervously on the witness stand. "Do you recognize him?" The witness hesitated, blinked, looked down. I don't know." Garash ripped off the disguise overlay, revealing the unmistakable face of the Indiana Jones star. "If you can't recognize Harrison Ford in a disguise, how can you claim to recognize James King?" The jury shifted uncomfortably. The prosecution's strongest weapon had just been weakened. Then came the missing gun, the Colt .38 revolver, believed to be the murder weapon. Prosecutors argued that King had used his old police-issued revolver, but he had conveniently thrown it away months before the robbery. Buckley stepped forward, facing the jury. This was a police officer, a man who carried his revolver for 25 years, and we're supposed to believe he just threw it away? His voice hardened. Or did he throw it away because he had just murdered 4 people with it? The courtroom stilled. It was a strong argument, but then Garash struck back. He forced ballistics experts to admit something shocking. They had no way to prove that King's missing revolver was the actual murder weapon. No shell casings had been left behind. The killer had carefully reloaded the revolver and taken the casings with him. So what do we have? Garash boomed. A missing gun that we've never seen, never tested, never recovered. And yet, you expect this jury to convict a man on nothing but a guess. The jury members exchanged glances. Another crack in the case. Perhaps the most puzzling moment of the trial came when the prosecution revealed what King had done the day after the heist. On June 17, 1991, just hours after the robbery, James King had walked into First Bank of Westland and upgraded his safe deposit box. The bank teller who assisted him took the stand. I remember him carrying a green expandable folder, and he used the private viewing room every time he came in. A ripple went through the courtroom. Buckley pounced. "Mr. King, if you had nothing to hide, why did you suddenly need a bigger safe deposit box the very day after the robbery?" The jury watched King carefully, but he remained calm. His lawyer, Garash, stepped in. This is a man who kept detailed records of his chess games, his police notes, his personal files. He needed more space. "That's it." "Then why?" Buckley pressed. "Did he go back to check on the box multiple times in the following weeks?" Garash shook his head. "You're grasping at straws, Mr. Buckley." The defense had successfully deflected suspicion, but doubt still lingered in the jurors' minds. What exactly had King been doing in that safe deposit box? And more importantly, where was the stolen money? The trial dragged on, but eventually, the fate of James King landed in the hands of 12 jurors. They were divided. The case against him was convincing, but full of holes. No physical evidence, no gun, no money, and eyewitnesses who changed their story. But he was a former cop with inside knowledge, and the coincidences were piling up. Tensions inside the jury room ran high. They argued for 9 days, the longest jury deliberation in Colorado history. Some were convinced he was guilty. Others weren't sure. And that's when it happened. A single juror, exhausted, frustrated, gave in. "I still think he did it," the juror admitted, "but I have reasonable doubt." And that was all it took. The foreperson stood. The verdict was ready. The courtroom was packed when the jury filed in. James King sat motionless, his face unreadable. The judge took the verdict slip. "Read it," passed it to the clerk. The silence was deafening. Then, "Not guilty." The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, some in outrage, others in relief. King's family wept. The families of the murdered guards were devastated. James King stood up slowly. A free man, after months of investigation, a massive trial, and an entire city demanding justice. The Father's Day massacre was still unsolved. The courtroom erupted in a chaotic mix of gasps, whispers, and outrage. For the families of the 4 murdered security guards, the verdict hit like a death sentence all over again. They had spent months reliving the horror of that morning, sitting through 3 grueling weeks of testimony, only to watch the only suspect walk free. James King, expressionless as ever, stood slowly. The cameras flashed, catching every angle of the moment a man accused of one of the deadliest bank heists in Denver's history left the courtroom without a single charge sticking. Outside, a mob of reporters swarmed him, microphones thrust forward, their voices overlapping. "Mr. King, what do you have to say to the victims' families? Are you planning to file a lawsuit for wrongful prosecution? Did you do it?" King didn't answer. He simply walked past them, flanked by his high-profile defense team, his wife following close behind. His lawyer, Walter Garash, grinned like a victorious gladiator. "This case should have never gone to trial," he declared. "My client is an innocent man." But for the citizens of Denver, the question remained. Had justice been served? Or had a cold-blooded killer just outplayed the system? Though King had beaten the criminal trial, the FBI wasn't done with him. The stolen $200,000 had never been recovered, and that meant the case wasn't closed. Behind the scenes, the FBI launched a secret operation, hoping to find any clue that could tie King to the missing money. They watched his bank accounts. They tapped his phone lines. They even placed undercover agents near his home, hoping to catch him slipping up. But King never made a move. No sudden spending sprees. No unexplained purchases. No signs that he had stashed away stolen money. For all their efforts, King remained a ghost. One agent, frustrated with the lack of progress, summed it up perfectly. "If he did it, he's either the smartest damn criminal we've ever seen or we got the wrong guy." And that question would haunt investigators for years. After the trial, King became a shadow of his former self. Gone was a confident, ambitious cop who once dreamed of becoming police chief. In his place was a paranoid, reclusive man, one who believed the FBI was watching him until the day he died. He never worked again. He avoided public places. He rarely spoke to media. He installed iron bars on his home's windows, a stark contrast to the quiet suburban neighborhood where he lived. Neighbors whispered about him. "I saw him once at the grocery store," one woman recalled. "He looked over his shoulder the whole time, like someone was following him." His wife stood by him until her death in 2009. After that, King's health deteriorated rapidly. By the early 2010s, dementia had taken hold. The once sharp, calculated man who had evaded conviction in one of Colorado's most notorious crimes could barely remember his own name. And in 2013, James King died alone in his small bungalow, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. But the mystery of the Father's Day massacre didn't die with him. There was still one massive unanswered question. Where was the money? Despite years of investigation, The stolen $200,000 was never recovered. No sudden deposits. No extravagant purchases. No evidence that the money had ever surfaced anywhere. It was as if it had simply vanished. Yet, King had once slipped up in a rare post-trial interview. A local journalist, Paula Woodward, had asked him a hypothetical question. If you had done this, where would you have hidden the money? King chuckled. I probably would have buried it, he said. Somewhere up in the mountains. It was offhand, almost playful, but it sparked a legend. For years after King's death, amateur treasure hunters scoured the Colorado mountains, digging through remote locations, hoping to unearth the missing cash. To this day, no one has ever found a single dollar, and some believe the money is still out there, waiting to be discovered. Decades have passed since that bloody Father's Day morning in 1991. Yet the case remains one of Denver's greatest mysteries. No other suspect was ever arrested. No other trial was ever held. No justice was ever served for the four men who lost their lives. For the families of the victims, the pain never faded. Phil Manoff's stepdaughter once said in an interview, "It's like he was murdered twice, first by the gunman, and then again when they let his killer walk free." Today, when you walk past United Bank Tower, there is no memorial, no plaque, just a quiet building with a dark history. A crime so precise, so cold, so perfectly executed. It left behind only two things: unanswered questions and a legend that refuses to die.